cowboy rode in from the east with nothing but a sway-backed gelding and a pair of boots splitting at the seams. Dust clung to his coat like he'd crawled out of the earth itself, and the way he sat the saddle said he'd known hard miles and harder men. Folks in town didn't bother asking where he came from. They'd seen enough drifters pass through with eyes like his, quiet, watchful, full of past lives. He heard about the job from an old drunk on the steps of the post office. The widow was hiring hands, not much pay, the man said, but steady work and meals. Out past Split Rock, he slurred. Biggest spread north of the Pecos, though you wouldn't know it. Looks like just another dry-boned ranch, but she got reach. Owns more land than the bank, some say. The cowboy didn't ask more. He nodded, mounted up, and turned his horse towards Split Rock. By dusk, he saw the outline of the widow's ranch. A longhouse of weathered oak, a barn half-collapsed at the south end, a corral with 3 half-wild mustangs kicking at the rails. It looked like every failing patch of land he'd ever seen. She was waiting for him, not on the porch, not from behind a curtain, but standing in the dirt, arms crossed, a shotgun resting casual against her hip. She wore a man's duster over a dress gone gray with age and smoke. Her hair was pinned, her face like dry stone, lined but steady, unreadable. "You come for work?" she asked. "I did." "Got a name?" He thought about lying, thought better. "Wheeze." "Wheeze what?" He tipped his hat. "Wheeze is enough." She stared at him long enough he figured she was weighing how much trouble he could cause, or maybe how much he'd take before he broke. Finally, she jerked her head toward the bunkhouse. "You'll start with fence posts." "North line gone soft. Coyotes have been slipping through. If I lose another calf, I'll start docking pay. Supper at 7. Don't expect a bell." He nodded and led his horse toward the barn. The first 3 weeks passed like that, quiet work, mended fences, hauling water, clearing deadwood. The widow didn't speak more than needed. Her foreman, a barrel-chested man named Hatch, kept the other hands in line. There weren't many of them, 4 in total, counting Wheeze, and all of them kept their heads down, but Wheeze watched. He watched how supplies came in heavy, though the ranch didn't seem to sell cattle. He watched the way men tipped their hats when they passed the outer fence, not just the ranch hands but riders from neighboring counties. He watched how the sheriff came every 3rd Wednesday, handed over a slip of paper, and rode out without a word. And he saw the way the widow's eyes moved when she stood on the porch at dusk, scanning the far hills like she expected war. One night, over black coffee and sour bread, we asked Hatch how long the widow had run the place. "Since her man died," Hatch said, not looking up. "Going on 10 years now. She managed all this on her own." Hatch chewed a bite of beans before answering. "Ain't on her own, she's got interests." "What kind?" Hatch gave him a look. "Best not to ask." Weez nodded slow and said no more, but in his bones he knew. This wasn't a widow clinging to what little she had left. This was something else. The whole place stank of it, power kept quiet, lines drawn in silence. And the more he watched, the more he saw how many men bowed their heads when she walked by, not from pity but from fear. He kept his boots on at night. By the 2nd month, he started riding fence line alone. The widow trusted him enough for that, or maybe she wanted to see if he'd wander where he shouldn't. Either way, he took the horse up into the northern ridges, where the land turned sharp and mean. And there, tucked into a canyon that didn't show on the old maps, he saw it, another corral, larger than the one near the house. 50, maybe 60 head of cattle, branded with a mark he hadn't seen before. A broken horseshoe over a bar. He turned back before sunset, but his gut twisted all the way home. That night he asked Hatch about the cattle. "We only run a dozen, far as I seen," he said. "You seen the North Range lately?" Hatch didn't answer, just got up, dumped his plate, and walked out. That was when Weez knew. The widow wasn't just scraping by, she was sitting on a kingdom. And every man who worked for her was either too afraid or too deep in her pocket to speak. Still, he stayed, not out of fear, not even out of need. He stayed because he'd seen something in her eyes the day he arrived. Something buried under all that stone. It wasn't kindness, it was rage. Old, coiled rage, the kind that builds empires or burns them down, and we's knew rage. It was the only thing that had kept him alive this long. Spring brought the rains late, and when they came cruel. The red dirt turned to clay, and the creek swelled fast enough to drag off a heifer before anyone could rope it. We's worked 12-hour days with mud to his knees and no thanks for it. He didn't mind. He was watching. Every storm stripped more bark from the truth. He started noticing wagons that came in the dead of night, canvas-covered and escorted by armed riders. They didn't stop at the house or the barn. They passed through, quiet as ghosts, toward the east ridge. We marked their wheels in the soft ground and followed one morning on foot, keeping to the trees. What he found wasn't just another herd. It was a depot built out of sight in the crags. A dozen men ran it, none from the ranch crew. Crates stacked high with tools, dynamite, feed, guns, too. We's counted 3 cases before he backed away. Not rusted hunting rifles, but new iron wrapped in oilcloth, repeaters, carbines, enough to arm a regiment. Back at the ranch, the widow didn't say a word. But that night, Hatch pulled him aside. "You looking to die young, Wheeze?" He met the man's eyes. "I seen a lot of strange things. You think curiosity's what kills men like me?" Hatch lit a smoke with a shaking match. "No, but you're not from here. You don't know what she's done to keep this land." "I'm starting to." She gave her husband a Christian burial, 2 days after she cut his throat. We said nothing. She was 17. He was a bastard of a man, beat her till her face broke. No sheriff touch it. His family ran half the county. Then one night, the house burned and she walked out with a broken hand and the deed in her dress. "You were here then." "I helped bury him. We didn't sleep that night." The widow had never spoken of her past. She didn't wear mourning clothes, didn't keep a portrait above the hearth. But she moved like someone who'd lived through fire and chosen to become it. The next morning, she handed Weeze a rifle. "Ride west with me," she said. They took a wagon up through the ridge road, past the outer fence, into scrub country that hadn't seen settlers in years. She didn't speak for the first hour. Then she pulled up the reins and pointed to a line of stakes hammered into the dry earth. "That's bared land," she said, "or so he claims." We scanned the hills. No cattle, no fences, no sign of life, just heat and old bones. "Who's bared?" "Man who thinks he can take what's mine. The courthouse is in his pocket, Judge too, so we redraw the lines our way." "You planning to fight?" She looked at him like she'd been waiting for that question. "I've been fighting for 20 years, Wheeze. I just stopped making noise about it." They marked the land together, planting new fence posts deep and driving iron caps onto them. She carried a revolver on her hip the whole time. When a rider showed up from the South Trail, young, full of spit, she stepped between Wheeze and the boy and leveled the gun. "You got 3 seconds to turn around." The rider hesitated, spat into the dirt, then rode off without a word. Wheeze didn't ask who he was, he didn't need to. Back at the ranch, changes came quick. A second bunkhouse went up. More hands arrived, quiet men, ex-soldiers, runaways. They didn't ask questions. They followed orders and kept their heads down. Wheeze found himself promoted without ceremony. The widow started asking his opinion, not often, but enough to matter. She took supper in the main house now, and sometimes he was invited. She never drank, never removed her coat, even in the heat. But once, when lightning cracked over the valley and the fire jumped in the hearth, she told him the truth. My husband's family owned 3 counties: cotton, cattle, oil. He was the youngest, weakest, meanest of them. They gave him me like a dowry. When I put him in the ground, I thought they'd hang me for it, but they underestimated me. You kept the land. I kept everything. We's leaned back in his chair. You think they're still watching. They've been watching this whole time, just waiting for me to die slow or get soft. You don't strike me as soft. She smiled barely. That's why you're still breathing. By midsummer, the ranch was more than it had ever been. Lines had been drawn, sides taken. We didn't know where it would end, but he knew war when he saw it. And the widow, she was building something more than a ranch. She was building a fortress. The first blood came not with a shot, but with a silence. It was just past harvest moon when the youngest hand, a boy called Lyle who barely filled his boots, didn't come back from his ride. They found his horse near the south ravine, reins dragging, saddle empty. We rode out with Hatch and 2 others, circling the canyons till they found the boy's body hung from a mesquite tree, stripped of gun and boots, mouth stuffed with dirt. Pinned to his chest was a broken horseshoe. We cut him down with a blade he kept for finer things. Hatch said nothing, just stared off at the horizon like it owed him a debt. They buried Lyle that same night without song, the widow standing silent in the rain, her coat plastered to her shoulders like a shroud. She didn't cry. The next morning, she summoned Wheeze into the longhouse. The map was already unrolled on the table, stretched and yellowed, marked with grease pencil lines and blood-dark ink. They're testing us, she said, voice dry as bark. Baird. His men, not locals, hired, might be Southern. Might be old Pinkertons. What do you want from me? She tapped a point on the northern ridge. There's an old watch station up there, abandoned since the rail pulled out. I want eyes there, yours. He took the map without argument. By week's end, he was living out of a tent, rifle across his lap, watching the valley through a spyglass. What he saw disturbed him more than the killing. Riders moved in formation, not just cattle thieves or drunk ranch hands. These were drilled men, disciplined, never alone, always moving in arcs that flanked the ranch from 2 sides. He saw them test the river crossings. He saw them cut water lines, burn supply caches. They didn't want to fight, not yet. They wanted starvation. We sent word back on foot. Twice his messengers didn't return. When he rode back himself, 2 weeks later, he found the ranch dug in. The fence had been doubled. New trenches cut through the south pasture. Hatch was limping from a fresh bullet wound in the thigh. One of the bunkhouses had been torched. The air stank of fear masked with smoke. The widow was waiting in the barn, cleaning a rifle by lamplight. You were right, he told her. I usually am. They're not coming to bargain. I stopped believing in bargains when they buried my sisters in a ditch for refusing marriage. She said it like she was talking about weather. Like the rage in her had calcified into something colder. We looked at her then and saw the full weight of what she carried. Not just land, not just revenge, legacy. You're going to war, he said. I already did. This is just the cost of keeping it. She gave him a ledger before dawn, a list of names, addresses, old debts owed to her late husband's house, people who might turn sides for coin or hate or fear. I need alliances, she said. You pick the ones who won't slit my throat after shaking my hand. So he's rode out again, but not to fight, to recruit. He found a former sheriff in Rust Creek who owed the widow a favor from decades back, and a gang of ex-rail guards down in Harlan County who remembered her name like it was still whispered on wanted posters. He promised gold, land, whatever it took. Most came not for money, but because they hated the same men she did. When he returned 3 weeks later, he brought 16 riders, a munitions cart, and a letter from a judge in Iron Hollow willing to falsify deeds in her name. The widow read it all without expression. Then she touched Wee's arm and said, "You've done more in a month than my own kin did in 10 years." He didn't answer. That night she handed out iron and orders. There would be no cavalry, no marshal. Just them, just what they could take and hold. "We strike first," she said, standing before the fire like a preacher in hell. "Not because it's right, because if we don't, they will salt this land and piss on our graves." Hatch raised a bottle. "Then let them come." But we saw the look in her eye. She wasn't waiting. She was already sharpening the knife. They struck at midnight, when the wind howled down from the ridgelines and the moon sank behind the canyon lip. We led the first charge. A dozen riders split into two wings, moving fast and low across the dry basin toward Baird's forward camp. No torches, no voices, just hoofbeats swallowed by dust. The camp was bigger than he'd expected, tents, a cook fire still glowing, 6 guards posted with rifles. But they were drunk or careless or both. We shot the first without hesitation, caught the second in the throat before he could raise the alarm. The rest fell quick, surprised, scrambling for boots they never got to lace. One fled on foot. They let him run. They burned the supplies and left the bodies where they fell. At dawn, Baird's banner flew half-mast above his main house in the valley, black field, red bull, broken arrow. We watched it through his glass and counted the men they'd lost. None, 2 wounded. The widow's plan had worked. Strike fast, cut deep, leave fear in the blood, but victory didn't bring rest. Retaliation came on the 6th night. We woke to screaming. The west pasture was in flames, horses screaming in the smoke, 2 men down before he'd even pulled on his boots. Baird's riders had come silent and savage, cutting fences, burning stores, poisoning the well with raw lie. They disappeared just as quick, vanishing into the canyons like they'd never been there. The widow stood in the firelight, barefoot, rifle in hand. Her dress was stained with ash. One of her dogs lay dead beside her. She didn't speak. We stepped beside her, his face slick with sweat. "They're not afraid anymore." "No," she said, voice quiet. "They're angry." She buried the dead herself. No ceremony, just earth and stone. By morning, the house was boarded tight and new lookouts posted with orders to shoot before speaking. But the damage ran deeper than bodies. The water was poisoned for 2 days. The cattle panicked, trampled the south fence. 3 hands quit by nightfall, and one set the bunkhouse on fire before disappearing into the hills. We saw the cracks forming, loyalty stretched thin, supplies dwindling, sleep stolen in hours, not nights. Still, she didn't break. Instead, she called a council in the smokehouse, where no windows faced outward and the walls were thick with years of salt and silence. Her allies sat in a rough circle, rail guards, bounty men, former law, hard men who'd once killed for less than what she now promised them. We stood by the door, watching. She spoke only once. "We're not holding this land. We're taking theirs." Gasps, silence, then murmurs. She stepped into the light and unrolled a new map, one not of her property, but Baird's holdings, his ranch, his private roads, his mines. They sent hired guns. "We send fire." What followed wasn't battle, it was siege. Every night they rode to a different edge of Baird's empire, sabotaged a rail, set fire to a warehouse, cut a fence, killed a guard. Always moving, never staying long enough for a counterstrike. The goal wasn't ground. It was blood, time, fear. Baird's men started wearing bandanas over their faces. Rumors spread of a witch on horseback, of a ghost widow who fed the coyotes with men's bones. Weez laughed the first time he heard it, but then he saw the men who whispered it, grown, calloused, shaking at shadows. It wasn't just the widow's wrath they feared. It was the quiet in her vengeance. One night Weez found her sitting alone in the loft, staring at a portrait long covered in dust. A child's face, half faded, A girl no older than 6, hair in braids. He didn't ask. She noticed him and nodded once. She was mine. My daughter died before all this. How? Cholera, they said, but I know who kept the doctor from coming. Baird's men. Said I owed a levy for water rights, that I'd pay in land or blood. We's looked down at the dirt floor. That's why this isn't just about borders. She met his eyes. This is about debt, and I intend to collect. By month's end, Baird's supply lines were shattered. His northern fence was rubble, his cattle scattered across no man's land. Still he held the manor, and we knew why. He was drawing them in. So when the widow ordered the final strike, we argued. We've got the high ground, he said. Starve him out, let him come to us. But she shook her head. He doesn't beg. He buries. If I wait, he'll hire more, dig in deeper. I go now or I lose everything. That night she armed every man and woman on the ranch. Gave them new rifles, fresh powder, iron rounds. Some were shaking, some prayed. All of them stood with her. The widow stepped into the yard and raised her voice once. Tomorrow we ride, into his valley, into his teeth. Some of you will die. If you want to leave, do it now. No one moved, so she nodded. And the next morning, under a blood-red dawn, they rode out, not as ranchers, not as laborers, but as something older, as vengeance made flesh. They reached Baird's manor at dawn, the sun a dull coin behind black clouds. The air held a stillness we had only felt in graveyards, like the earth itself had drawn breath and held it. The house rose from the valley floor like a wound, 3 stories of pale stone, flanked by oak columns and iron grates. No guards on the porch, no dogs barking, just silence, too much of it. They dismounted 50 yards out. The widow stepped forward, rifle over her shoulder, her coat snapping in the wind. We moved to her side. This isn't right, he muttered. She nodded once. He's waiting. From the roofline came the crack of a shot. The man beside Wees fell, blood arcing across the gravel. Then all hell opened. Gunfire from the upper windows, shouts from hidden pits in the field, a dozen men rising from beneath camouflage netting. Baird had built a kill box, and they had ridden straight into it. Wees dragged the widow behind a stone outcropping, bullets chipping the air. He planned for this. I know. You still want to push. She looked at him then, eyes burning like coals, face calm. Yes. So they did. The first wave charged, drawing fire. We flanked wide with 6 riders, stormed the east wall, lobbed Molotovs into the upper windows. Flames burst through the curtains. Screams followed. The second wave breached the gate, only to be met by a mounted countercharge, men in black dusters, sabers flashing. But the widow's allies were worse than they looked. Rail guards crushed them under the wheels of a stolen steam cart, shot anything that moved. We fought like a man with nothing left to fear. He killed 6 in the orchard alone, one with a fence picket when his rifle jammed. Blood soaked his hands, the cuffs of his coat, the inside of his mouth where a tooth had broken. He didn't stop. At the center of it all, the widow walked through fire. She didn't run, didn't crouch. Just moved straight down the gravel path, coat trailing smoke, shotgun in hand. When the front doors opened and Baird himself stepped out, white beard, silver pistol, a dozen hired men flanking him, she didn't flinch. He shouted her name. She raised the shotgun and fired. His shoulder exploded. The men around him opened fire, but Wees had already reached the porch. He tackled one, stabbed another in the throat with a horseshoe nail. By the time he looked up, Baird was crawling, pistol lost, blood staining the stone like oil. The widow stepped over his body. He coughed, reached for something in his boot, but she kicked him onto his back. He blinked up at her, mouth working, eyes rimmed with disbelief. You can't, he rasped. I built this. You stole it. You're just a... She shot him in the mouth. The echo rolled through the valley like thunder. Afterward, we sat on the porch steps, watching smoke curl into the sky. The house was burning behind him. Half the men were dead. Hatch was gut-shot and fading fast, but the manor had fallen. The enemy was broken. The widow came and sat beside him, arms streaked with blood, one boot missing. "It's done," he said. She didn't answer. They watched the sun rise in silence, red light cutting through ash. Later, they buried the dead, marked no graves. Just stones turned inward. The ranch hands, the allies, even